So welcome to the panel discussion on regulatory issues of the Neuroethics Learning Collaborative. Today what we're going to do is focus on the ways in which neuroscience raises unique issues in the regulation of research and business, both the development of products, getting them approved by the FDA, and marketing them. The guests that we have teaching today in the panel discussion are, to my immediate left, Joe Powers, who you know from the Conflict of Interest vlog. Joe is the executive director of the Center for Neuroscience and Society at Penn. He spent many years in the pharmaceutical industry and is currently working on a bioethics degree and a business degree, and in his spare time, executive directing the center. Next to him is Jason Karlawish. Jason is an internist and geriatrician who specializes in the mental effects of aging, as well as neurodegenerative diseases of aging. And he's particularly interested in the ethical, legal, and social implications of these conditions in our society. He's a senior fellow at the Penn Bioethics Center and a member of the faculty at the Center for Neuroscience and Society. And finally, at the end of the line, we have Jon Merz, who delivered the 2 lectures on regulatory issues earlier in the semester. Jon, as you may remember, is a professor in the Department of Biomedical Ethics at Penn. Also, on his way here, racked up degrees in business, law, and engineering and public policy, so is very well equipped to discuss these issues. So what I'm going to do is just go through the regulatory issues that we discussed in the previous classes, pretty much in the order we discussed them, and ask these gentlemen about the special ways in which neuroscience intersects with these issues. What extra wrinkles are introduced into issues like human subjects, protection, animal subjects, and so forth, by the fact that the organ system in question is the brain. The first question has to do with human subjects, and in particular research on human subjects who are patients with either neurological or psychiatric diseases that affect their ability to give informed consent. And I'm going to put this question to Jason. I'm guessing that that complicates the process of informed consent and therefore the whole research enterprise.
Yeah, well, it certainly introduces a challenge, namely, fundamental human subject protection is informed consent, a voluntary agreement by a competent adult to enroll. So if you have an illness that impairs your ability to perform your usual and everyday activities, one of those usual and everyday activities might be the ability to make decisions, and certainly a decision about enrolling in research could be one that would be you would no longer potentially be able to make because your decisional capacity is sufficiently impaired that you'd be judged unable to make the decision, even if you can choose to be in the research. By saying, yes, I want to be in it, you may not have adequate understanding of the research such that one would be legitimately ethically concerned that you're involved in something you, quote, don't understand. So yeah, obviously it's a challenge in a field which is studying brains, particularly brains that are in some way not working as well as they used to. The paradigm disease would be Alzheimer's disease, but any other neurodegenerative dementias, extreme states of persons with schizophrenia, where there's cognitive impairments as well, would be another example. Having said that, 20, 30 years of research have been going on clearly with these patients producing drugs, as well as biological measures of the disease. So investigators have clearly been able to, in some way, work through that challenge. Nonetheless, it remains a challenge.
I mean, what just, in very concrete, simple terms, I mean, what do you do? Is there, do you have to have somebody who's their guardian, or how do you get consent?
Well, some of it's in the design of the research. So one obvious approach would be to set your eligibility criteria such as your pretest probability that the people who you're involving might be capable of making the decision is reasonably high. That gets to issues then of a bias, that you're sort of focusing on one population over another in terms of severity. Another is to make sure that the person has a study partner, someone else who will be with them during the course of enrollment, participation, and follow-up to ensure that they're able to participate in the research, and if there are problems, that's made sort of aware to the researchers, look after the person's best interest. The phrase study partner is sort of a new phrase in Alzheimer's. The traditional term people use is the caregiver, but this is trying to really emphasize this particular role in the study that caregiver has. If you're particularly bothered about the risks of research and really feel that an individual who enrolls really needs to know what they're getting involved in, you want to document that and to set your evidentiary standard very high, more so than document it. You can set up a process to assess decisional capacity at the time of enrollment. So, for example, a series of questions that would assess understanding that the people sort of have to pass. You've got to get an 80% on these questions. And if you do, and you want to be in the research, you're in. If you don't, regardless of what your decision is, we're not going to let you in the research. Yeah, I think that's particularly useful when you have studies that, again, present risks that are part of the research that are more than just minimal and no reasonable prospect of benefit to the subjects themselves. Studies that involve, physiologic challenges or assessment of biomarkers, et cetera, that aren't part of therapeutic components of a clinical trial. So, these are solvable issues. I think that one key point I always find is that one can overprotect this population as much as underprotect them. That is to say, exclude them from varieties of research that could potentially advance their interests as patients, depending on the research, as well as the class of persons that they're part of.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, speaking of sort of depriving them of participating in research, we've all read about these brain imaging studies of vegetative patients. I mean, the last one was on the front page of the New York Times just about a week or so ago. Yeah, right. And apparently, this research is progressing extremely slowly, in part because it's you can't get consent from a vegetative patient, and also I gather from talking to Joy Hirsch, who's one of the researchers in this area, that the laws governing protection of human subjects vary from state to state, but in New York State, where she's based, and Nicholas Schiff, who's also done a lot of this imaging of these patients are based, makes it virtually impossible to enroll these patients.
Yeah, New York is probably the most challenging state. There is what is interesting, just as a sort of policy point, is the lack of any national policy for research that involves adults with disorders that may impair their decisional capacity. We have regulations for research that involve children, that involve prisoners, that involve pregnant women and fetuses, but we've never as a country in some 30, now 40 years, been able to agree on a set of guidelines for research that involve persons with impaired decisional capacity. I think a lot of that is because the ground upon which we understand and describe that group of people has been shifting for 40 years. The first federal effort was titled Regulations for Research that Involve Persons Institutionalized with Mental Disorders, or something like that. I mean, it was so 50s that it was kind of amusing that by the time they got to the regulations, they realized that this title of the regs was outdated. And it's been that way. They write the regs, but they're sort of answering to past concerns and understandings and language. And it's only recently, really, I think, that we've achieved consensus that the issue is disorders that impair decisional capacity. And part of that is because, the realization that it's not just, quote, mental illness that impairs decisional ability, and indeed, actually, many mental illnesses have no effect on decisional ability of any clinical significance. In most cases of anxiety and depression that are clinically managed are not of any cognitive significance. And there are a lot of illnesses that have nothing to do with mental illness, whatever that is, that impair capacity tremendously, like acute cardiac arrest or critical illness or any number of below-the-neck syndromes, if you will. Mm-hmm. So anyway, what you're left with is this patchwork of state-by-state guidance. And New York is notorious as probably the most restrictive state vis-a-vis the role of other people to make decisions for adults who can't make decisions for themselves. And both in research as well as it's very frustrating in clinical circumstances as well. New York State has some very odd rules and regulations designed to, quote, protect the mentally ill, which I think actually get in the way of, in many cases, taking care of the mentally ill, although that's a debatable point.
Yeah, can you say it's more conservative than the regulations, the Fed regulations on children?
More conservative than the federal regulations that exist on children. Yeah, because they would essentially say that if you took the New York State approach, they would say a parent can't give consent for their child. And that is certainly not the case in the federal regulations. For kids, parents can give consent for their kids.
It depends on the levels of risk, though.
Well, no, but New York State would say you can't. So they would just...
Regardless of the level of risk.
So there's no one that can consent for...
Yeah. So a lot of researchers in New York, I think, sort of play fast and loose with...
Yeah.
They say, well, he gave consent, which meant they said yes.
Well, you know what Joy does? She puts him in a car and drives him across the bridge. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, well, before we leave the topic of research subjects, I want to touch briefly on the topic of animal research subjects and how they intersect with, neuroscience-specific concerns. Obviously, there's been a huge amount of, rancor and violence and, extremely strong feelings and poor communication on these topics. And I think that's a shame because I think there are some very important issues here that many scientists feel they can't talk about because, their colleagues will think they're anti-science for showing any concern at all with, animal welfare or any dissatisfaction with current guidelines. But I think in the realm of animal research in neuroscience, actually I'll quote my colleague Jon Chatterjee here at Penn, who has said, isn't it strange that we think that certain animals are good enough models for the human brain and human behavior that we can use them in our research for this purpose, but then when the question of discomfort, suffering, and so forth comes up, we revert to, but they're just animals, don't anthropomorphize. And I think Jon raises a good point. I think if we're honest, it's very hard to know, the extent of, the extent to which the psychological needs of animals in research are unmet. And I think purely from the point of view of the research itself, it bears thinking about how valid are the results from animal research pertaining to mental function, brain function, when the research subjects are possibly, and we don't really know the extent to which this is true, but in some cases might well be, isolated, stressed, and sort of not in a normal, healthy frame of mind, or frame of, if you don't want to say mind for an animal, whatever, sort of affective state. I think, there are, of course, important issues with, animal welfare in any kind of research, but I think particularly for neuroscience research, where, the very reason we're using these animals is we think they have similarities to us, and we think we can learn something about, mental and brain function. It really bears looking at how, how the unnatural conditions under which they're kept might, in fact, influence research results. Okay, I'm trying to think, does anybody else have a comment on human or animal subjects and brain research?
I did find it interesting, actually, I don't know if Autumn talked about this when she did the animals, but it seems that the big cases in animals research that kind of came to the fore involved the brains in some ways.
Yeah,
so
the head injury.
The head trauma stuff generally was smacking baboon-zygous and
Yeah, I can't remember what kind of primate it
causing
was.
brain damage. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the video on that. We have it available, you can see it. And in another case, there was a guy in Texas who was shooting cats in the head, basically to figure out what kind of brain injuries would be sustained and how you save them. And that actually translated very directly into wartime. That's why we're saving soldiers in the field nowadays. And so it's very valuable research, but it's also really troubling research when you think about what you're doing to these animals.
Yeah,
We're not comfortable with
absolutely.
it.
Yeah, I've often found that the studies that involve tests of the effect of nurturing and play on animals and on brain function disturbing, because I wouldn't want to be the dog randomized to the crate that's just some newspaper and a bowl of food for 3 years. Like the squeaky toys and the good food and play. And I've also found it very disturbing to think, what would it like to be a researcher or research tech doing that work, knowing that in the end I'm going to sacrifice these animals to look at their brains, to look at the effect of all the play I did with them.
Yeah.
Because when you watch the videos of the dogs, everyone immediately, they're beagles, they're cute little, you sort of coo and whatnot, and you realize, well, but another 6 months it's going to be on the abattoir slate. I find it very disturbing.
Well, it's apparently very difficult for the researchers. I mean, for the techs and the students and the PIs. Yeah, they
Because you've sort of bonded them not on the basis of, we just look at what their liver's doing and just crate them, but, you bond with them.
Yeah.
Or maybe you don't, maybe they sort of rotate the text or something. But then again, that would change the experimental conditions. I don't know, it's a very interesting topic, actually. Phenomenologically, I'd love to see what the text, someone's done work on that.
There has been some work on that, and what they find is, a high degree of stress. I mean, even techs working with rodents. And some people, and actually, when we started the course off, the very first online activity was for students to say what they were interested in the field of neuroethics and, how they thought it related to their own work. And I would say, half the people here, probably everybody, and that would probably be, if I've got my numbers right, everybody working with animals did mention the sort of the welfare of animals. So, yeah, a non-trivial issue, and it would be so nice if, as a science and as a society, we could engage with it without, some of the craziness that surrounds the issue. All right. Well, what I would like to go to next, I'm sort of moving now from the regulation of research to the regulation of business, of bringing drugs and devices to market. Now, the FDA has a standard set of procedures for approving new drugs, and we actually haven't so far in the course talked about that. Joe, can you give us just a few sentences of different stages of phases, get the lingo right, of clinical trial, and what those different trials are supposed to demonstrate to the FDA?
Yeah, and I think it's important also the term regulatory within the pharmaceutical industry maybe is a little bit different than it is in other contexts. The pharmaceutical industry, by its very nature, is regulated, extremely regulated. I worked in the post-marketing area where drugs are actually launched, and there's literally not a single word in an advertisement or a website or any material that has not gone through multiple checks and screens and hour-long debates on whether you can word literally every word that's there. So very regulated. In terms of the process that drugs go through, and this is very important when ideas come up, such as the question before, well, maybe we should do additional trials or add-on trials. Trials take a very long time and cost a tremendous amount of money, and they start usually
sort of like hundreds of millions. That be
yeah,
right?
I mean it's
No, not that much. Tens of millions.
Well, depending on the phase of the trial, it's estimated that the average drug takes about 10 to 15 years from when it's first identified to when it's commercialized, at roughly close to $1 billion in development costs. So these are...
John's shaking his head, so we have a...
Well, there's costs and then there's interest and lost opportunity costs.
Yeah, and of course, and
the substantial part of that.
Yeah, and the number of drugs that make it from the bench, so to speak, through the commercialized phase are very, very small. So, but with that said, so you typically will have you'll identify a molecule, whether that's something they were deliberately looking at in the lab or by accident, which oftentimes is the case. And you go first through a series of phases. And all of this is negotiated often as with the FDA. You'll describe the type of trial, the type of indication, and this is very important from a regulatory standpoint. So the FDA in the later phases will provide guidance on the drug indication. That's the little white package insert we call that says this drug is indicated for XYZ. And that's how you market it and how you promote it. That if doctors have the right to use a drug off-label, meaning not for the indication that's being used, but the pharmaceutical company cannot promote a drug off-label. This is very important in terms of how the trials are designed. So trials are designed in order to get a specific indication. It doesn't matter if a drug works for 100 different diseases. If they can only market and use the particular drug, the company can promote it for a specific indication. And so there's 3 phases that the company will go through, largely 3 main phases. Phase 1 is just kind of testing the drug out, usually in animals and starting in people, actually. Phase 2 is getting the dosing right. And phase 3 are the larger, much more expensive clinical trials that will lead to the particular indications. Oftentimes there's a phase 2B that we'll throw in, and the FDA will sometimes require post-marketing trials, phase 4 trials. But essentially you have these 3 phases that oftentimes take somewhere between 10 and 15 years till they reach that end phase of through approval.
And typically, so in a phase 3 trial, that's where you're supposed to complete the case that you're making to the FDA that the drug is both safe or safe enough, in a kind of cost-benefit framework, and effective for whatever this indication is, effective enough. In terms of the safety, how long-term do they typically study drugs for? And I ask that because, again, coming back to our question of what unique issues arise when we're thinking about neuroscience and CNS products. Typically, drugs for neuropsychiatric illnesses, people take for years. What is the typical phase 3 trial tell us, and where I'm going?
That's a very good point, a valid point, and it's become much greater of a concern more recently, I would say over the last few years, with people taking antidepressants and antipsychotics for the rest of their lives. Each drug has a different length depending on a particular disease. Oncology drugs, for example, oftentimes in phase 3 or phase 2 before they reach phase 3, because this is a life or death situation, the FDA can kind of expedite it if it looks like it's okay, and sometimes they could have tested in patients for a matter of months, and they'll move forward and push the drug. There are orphan drugs, which are drugs that are designated orphan drug, meaning there are no other drugs in this particular class, so there's a clearly unmet need, and sometimes they can get kind of pushed in length of trials. But all of this is negotiated with the FDA, and it really depends on the particular drug. What's happening now is that the FDA is saying, we want you to do these post-marketing surveillance. So after the drug is approved, it will be approved on the condition that you do a longer study and assess what are the long-term issues with the drug. Now, the challenge with that is that once the drug is approved, the companies, whether they get around to doing the long-term trials and fulfilling those commitments is another story, and many companies don't end up doing it, or it takes more time. And so this is definitely an issue, and something that needs to be addressed and guided.
Very interesting.
Even without the studies in phase 4, when they do come to market, there are, in fact, over the last 20 years, with the kind of expedited procedures that have been implemented, really in a post-AIDS world, kind of getting drugs for really life-threatening conditions out through the process more quickly, there's been some evidence that the number of drugs pulled off the market has actually increased. So, like, just in the last 2 years, I think Rezulin, which was a diabetes drug, was yanked off the market. And there's actually, I don't know all the drugs, but there's a whole cohort of them that have been, they come on the market, and then as they're starting to use, no longer being used in just thousands of patients like in a phase 3 trial, but they're being used more generally by sick patients, people with lots of comorbidities and the like, and you find out that it isn't that great. And you want to start accumulating bad reports, and people come, especially clinicians, start to lose their trust in the new product, and they stop using it. It gets yanked.
And there's an added issue with the psychiatric medication. So oftentimes psychiatrists will say that psychiatry is more of an art than a science, and you kind of sprinkle a little bit of this and sprinkle a little bit of that. And there is a great deal of off-label use for medications. Now, not only are the drugs not studied long-term in the indicated area, but the off-label use, it's oftentimes not studied at all. And so this poses some serious issues. Unfortunately, pharmaceutical companies are unable to deal with this because these drugs are being used off-label, and we're finding this now in a lawsuit. Actually, Allergan is a company that's suing the FDA because of this particular issue and concerns around this issue. But that is definitely becoming an issue, more and more of an issue with cognitive enhancers and other psychiatric medications. We don't know short-term in the indicated area, and we really don't know in off-label use as well.
Is it true that there's more off-label use of psychiatric drugs than your average other drug? I mean, I'm guessing there would be, but I don't know for a fact.
Well, there's more creep of indication because these constructs tend to be defined in fairly loose ways, and the
diagnostic constructs.
Right, the diagnostic constructs, and the drugs themselves oftentimes define the constructs. I mean, social anxiety disorder, because if you take an SSRI, you're no longer anxious when you show up at a Friday night formal or whatever. So there's a looping effect. So inherently, under that sort of conceptual model, you can start to recarve definitions of disease. It's particularly concerning when you pull that definition out of clinical context and into sort of non-clinical markers of the disease, where you're approving on the basis of MRI results or other biological measures otherwise, other than clinical measures. Because then what you have is that you kind of lose mooring from the clinical phenomena, and you're saying, well, if you take this drug, it will slow the rate of decline, which could down the road lead to clinical decline. And most of the studies that are done both below the neck and above the neck, follow people for some amount of time to show that that's a valid statement. But the drugs are used in practice for years.
Right.
And so you get this disjunction between changes in the non-clinical measure, whatever that may be, versus what's happening clinically to the patient.
So the non-clinical measure would be some marker like an MRI scan or something like that.
So MS is a field that's desperately trying to push itself forward on the basis of MRI results to measure of the burden of MS in a brain. And I think that's a disease which, and its size and scope, while it's a devastating disease for any one individual who has it, or can be devastating, doesn't occupy a substantial tranche of public health risk. In contrast, you take a disease like Alzheimer's disease, where there may be 3 million people, there may be 5 million people with it. We don't know, but there's a lot of people who probably have it. And you start defining that disease on the basis of non-clinical markers and intervening. Your market is enormous and could grow as big as you want it to go. And B, if you go wrong, the consequences are not trivial, because many thousands of, potentially I suppose millions of people could be on your drug, where true proof of clinical efficacy was intuited from the results of correlations between what happened on your marker versus what would happen in clinical practice. I mean, and it's the case in cardiovascular disease, it's the case in diabetes, it's the case in osteoporosis. I mean, any disease that takes thousands of excuse me, thousands of days I meant, but it takes many years to unfold. You can't study it for the lifetime of the disease to truly show that you're effective. I suppose you could, but I mean, it'd be an enormous societal, very difficult study to do. So you have to just intuit that for this shorter amount of time, I will argue that it's good for this whole amount of time. And you're just frankly taking both a business risk as well as a public health risk when you do that. And I don't think that the current FDA model is in any way set up to really adequately deal with that from a regulatory perspective. And there's no criticism of FDA. FDA was designed to treat people with symptomatic conditions. In fact, that's one of the diseases that dominated America in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, which is when FDA regs were written. And the amendment you pointed out was put in place when AIDS was coming along and killing people right and left. And the model for developing drugs was, a slower model. Well, guess what? Politics changed the model. I mean, it wasn't a scientific decision. It was a policy decision. I'm not saying it was wrong. I'm just saying that I would argue
there is a risk and benefit from that.
Yeah.
Do you take greater risks?
Yeah. No, I think that and it's just that it becomes more problematic. I mean, AIDS was and as long as it's around, will be a horrible disease. I'm not denying that. But when you start to take the scope, I mean, of the population that could be taking some of these compounds, AIDS seems like a trivial problem in terms of just the magnitude of numbers of individuals that could take these drugs related to brain disorders.
Right. So if I could bring it back to psychiatry, so...
I was talking about psychiatry.
Yeah, and schizophrenia in particular, so we know that a lot
crazy
of...
people psychology,
yeah.
not
60% of people with Alzheimer's have behavioral disorders.
Yeah. So
not just schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia, many of the drugs that are available have a whole cascade of side effects and and long-term side effects, not just some extrapyramidal symptoms, but diabetes and metabolic syndrome. So, but I guess there's this risk-benefit analysis.
I think that's fairly straightforward, though. I mean, because schizophrenia, you're symptomatic or you're not. If the drug is working, your symptoms go down. It's a very easily followed clinical syndrome. They get better. How long you should maintain someone on it versus titrating them off. I mean, I think the paradigm works for that. Now, yeah, they were risky drugs, but I back to my field. Antipsychotics are used for behavioral disorder in Alzheimer's disease, and even though they're not approved for it, in fact, they're labeled against their use for agitation, but we still use them, but because we have a clear clinical endpoint to follow. That's much easier. Is the patient better or not?
I want to move to a different part of the FDA approval process, and that is FDA approval for devices. There's a lot of interest now, a lot of really exciting technical developments in devices for intervening in the brain as opposed to drugs. In fact, I think it would be not overly pessimistic or overly unfair to the pharmaceutical industry to say that we have not had any big breakthroughs in drug treatment of mental illness in a while, and nobody's standing by with bated breath expecting one. And so partly for that reason, there is a lot of interest in devices that can treat psychiatric disorders. There's vagal nerve stimulation, which actually is FDA approved for depression, I gather, with not the most solid evidence in the world. There are various kinds of transcranial stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and transcranial direct current stimulation. And there is deep brain stimulation, which has, in its relatively short history as a way of treating psychiatric illnesses, looked like it can do really good stuff for people. How does the, and this is going to you, Jon, how does the process of regulating or approving devices differ, if at all, from drugs?
I'm not really, I can't really say.
No?
I mean, I know some of the regulations, but I don't know enough to kind of speak on them.
I was a drug guy, not a device guy, but I can tell you that the device process is much easier, the approval process versus the pharmaceuticals, and oftentimes you can get a device approved, or actually to be able to use it, not necessarily the label approved, but to be able to use it based on a previously approved similar device. So you can simply say that this device has been shown to work on whatever it might be, and our device is somewhat similar, therefore we should get somewhat of an approval, not necessarily the full clinical approval, but to be able to use it with patients. Even that approach, the clinical trial phase is much shorter. The expense is oftentimes less than, vast majority of the time less than a drug, and so that's essentially what I can comment on.
My understanding is that, I mean, and it was designed with obviously, to address a sort of a logical issue, which was if all I'm doing is taking some aspect of my device and tweaking it to make it smaller or whatever it may be, why do I have to go through a whole routine of redeveloping, improving it? I think for some of the things you've described, Martha, though, I think either the device itself or the use of it is so innovative that it would need to roll back into the phases of testing that Joe outlined for drugs to show safety and then some sense of efficacy and then effectiveness. I think one of the challenges with those devices, kind of go back to human subject issues, is some of them tend to be destination therapies. By destination therapy is, once it's in, it's in. It's hard to take it out, particularly implantable things and whatnot. Or at least taking it out is not a trivial matter, And they're also, frankly, sort of interrelated ethical scientific issues, which is, who should get a device that's not functional so as to provide a control group, and is that really an appropriate control group or not, to sort of have a burr hole surgery without an actual device planted, whereas some people get the device planted and whatnot, or it's turned off in some and on in others. And I think that those are, I think the existing paradigms for research ethics can address those issues. I don't think they're deeply new, but I think neuroscientists, up to the ante on those things, because operating on the brain and putting things in the brain is not just from a sort of popular culture perspective, but certainly from a medical perspective should not be viewed as a light or trivial activity. And being in a control group in that group, you better make sure that control is truly as safe as possible.
And I think also the devices that are approved today for a lot of the psychiatric conditions are for conditions where drugs have not worked or failed. And
patients.
Patients, right. So again, this is like the oncology area. They're much more severe cases, and so you can kind of coerce, or I don't want to use necessarily the word coerce, but it's easier to get these things approved because of the immediate need. But I think with technology advancing, we're finding no, in fact, we can use technologies, before medications are being used, and that changes the equation.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point that the threshold for approvals, when things are desperate, or at least perceived to be desperate, typically drops. But yeah, the interesting issue, and some of it's an economic issue, I think, but also a clinical one is, would you want to find out that an expensive, hard-to-do device is more effective than the best drugs you have out there in a disease that's common, prevalent, et cetera? I mean, you sort of set yourself up for kind of a tragedy of, you've got a very effective treatment, but boy, it's really quite expensive. In some ways, it's no different than an expensive drug, or rare drug, whatever it may be, in terms of how to get it. But,
a pacemaker, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually there are a lot of parallels to what's going on in neuroscience as to what went on in cardiovascular disease since about the 1970s, which was, the initial trepidation of devices put into people to either beat their hearts or stimulate their hearts was real, because, if your heart stops beating, granted it's brain death, it's dead, but, if the heart goes, usually the brain's right after it. And in some sense, we at least prima facie, we're comfortable with these devices and whatnot, but yet there are debates in those areas still over who should get them, for how long they should get them for, and frankly their cost. I mean, because heart disease is common, and those devices are not cheap. And probably one way to look at scholarship in neuroscience as a devices is to look at devices for the heart.
Interesting. All right, we are almost out of time. I feel like, I don't know, Oprah or some talk show host.
No, it's great. Yeah, no, you're doing it great.
But
no,
we're not going to break for a commercial, but commercial interests is very much related to this next and final question. It's a question about conflict of interest, a question which Jon talked about in his lecture, which Joe vlogged about. That's a word, video vlog. So presumably we don't have too much more that needs to be said here, but let me just ask each of you in turn, maybe starting with Jon and just coming down, to just say a few words about why is it that so much of the conflict of interest news that we read, about, sort of unhealthy relationships between pharma and researchers,
why does it involve two really famous cases of psychiatrists?
Well, why does it involve the above the neck? Why does it involve neuropsychiatry as opposed to other? I mean, there's lots of other drugs. Psychiatric drugs are among the top 10 blockbuster drugs, but they're not the only ones. Why is all this conflict of interest?
It's actually a very interesting question. I mean, I don't know how much these drugs cost, but they are, like you said, they are essentially you're put on it for a really long period of time. And drug companies love drugs where people are chronic, because they basically get them on their drug, and then there's no motivation to get them off that drug, right? unless they're not doing well. And it sounds like that's
so the stakes are high.
One thing that's going on.
Yeah.
I mean, chemotherapies are extremely expensive, but you got a short course, except for Gleevec, which is a anti-cancer drug, and it's basically you can get it, you're on it until you die, kind of thing. And that's very expensive. That's $70,000, $80,000 a year now. I think they've been cutting the price. But it sounds like there's a similar thing here. So that if there's so much money to be made by getting people in there, then you're going to get, you want doctors who are thought leaders, and they're going to pay them, they're going to give them and get them to be their mouthpieces into the community. And maybe it's, I don't know, what is it about psychiatry? It's an interesting question.
I like this thesis. I agree that probably that has some plausible. I mean, drug companies are companies. Like, companies go for markets. And so, yeah, I suppose if you saw, here's a common prevalent disease for which the indication would be long-term use, I'd go after that market and I would find out how can I build that market. And so one way to build it is to shape the science. Plus, I think the other feature we talked about earlier is that, the diseases have fairly fungible borders at their constructs. So, if you can begin to shape the people who think about the constructs, you'll shape the disease, you'll reshape the use and the labeling of it. So, you're going to create this sort of looping between the company and the thought leaders about what's the disease, so.
But getting back to cardiac, I mean, cardiac disease, you get people on Lipitor and other kind of like long-term.
There's money in cardiac disease too, yes.
I'm sure, but it has been these psychiatrists are the ones who came out with the multi-million-dollar kind of like relationships.
Yeah. But I mean, interestingly, your cholesterol level is your cholesterol level, whereas, is this child really bipolar or is he something else? I mean, there is.
In Europe, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, depending on the country, is dramatically different rates and prevalence compared to the States. And some countries, as sort of the most cultural pushback is this is a U.S. creation largely driven by a market. I'm not saying one side's right or wrong, but you cannot deny that reality that you've got some nations as a general group saying this isn't a market and others saying it is.
Right. So there's leeway in psychiatry for opinion leaders.
You can shape and reshape diagnoses,
But I also think what's unique about
unique
about psychiatry is that there is still this enormous stigma around mental illness as somewhat of a kind of moral struggle, and so when you treat people that can't overcome their sadness or something like that, and you treat it with a pill, or the pharmaceutical industry is oftentimes seen as pill pushers, and doctors, psychiatrists are seen as pill pushers, and so the stigma of mental illness warrants some of these maybe enhanced scrutiny over these doctors. Now, why the American Psychiatric Association is so closely tied with the pharmaceutical industry, probably more so than any other medical association, that certainly doesn't help the case, but that's clearly producing excess scrutiny on psychiatry as a field, and certainly on the psychiatrists. And that's, I think, why you're finding these a lot of the high-profile cases of conflict of interest are involving psychiatry.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for participating, and that's a wrap.